In this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about how the grid was used in fine art historically and look at a couple of fine artists that have used grids in their work. And then we'll look specifically at Joseph Mueller Brockmann, and that will help us with our postcard assignment that we're going to be working on. So there's a good quote, space is never complete and finite. It is motion connected to the next space and the next. And that was by Marcel Breuer. He was a Bauhaus architect. And the grid has a lot to do with Gestalt. And Gestalt is the basic desire we all have for unity and harmony. And when we look at something, we either see the parts or the whole. And it's really important that we see the whole before we see the individual parts. The eye brain will organize components into a unified whole if the parts make sense and look like they belong together. If we're kind of confronted with too many unrelated units or parts, the eye brain will attempt to simplify, but then if it's not manageable, we'll just lose interest and it'll look unorganized and chaotic. Space is really important, is an important concept, and space will automatically connect elements. So wide spaces separate, narrow spaces connect, and the closer elements are, the more related they seem to be. A lot of fine artists have thought deeply about space and have created a variety of work using the concept of space and the organization of space. Annette Messenger is one of them. She's a French artist known for her installation work. In her sculpture, she uses photographs, prints, drawings, and other materials. And sometimes she'll bring together hundreds of photos. And in this particular sculpture, each photo was a small piece of the human body, and they hang from these strings really precisely. And some of the photos join, and some of the photos obscure other photos. It's really beautiful. This is a close-up of that installation. And you can see how she explored different ways to hang each photograph, and she aligned it differently. And just imagine how complex this would be. She had to measure out every single space and make sure it was precisely hung in that space. And here's lastly one other image of her work. Christian Boltanski is another artist that utilized a lot of grid-based concepts in his work. He's a French photographer, sculptor, a painter, an installation artist, and he lives and works, or he did, I'm not sure if he's still alive, but he lived and worked in Malakoff, and he was actually married to Annette Messenger, whom he sometimes would collaborate with. And his work is about, a lot of it's about the Holocaust, and it deals with death, memory, loss. And he really, in his biggest body of work, he sought to memorialize the anonymous and those who disappeared during the Holocaust. And so he would have these whole rooms full of photographs. And the photographs were sort of anonymous in that nobody knew who the people were. And the assumption is that these are sort of lost people, people who were lost to the Holocaust, who just disappeared. And it's really kind of sad and beautiful when you look at his work. You kind of just get captivated by the amount of images that he includes. He fills whole corridors and rooms. Sometimes he'll put in materials like clothing, and other items. And you're kind of focusing on this idea of the tragedy and how human and senseless it was. And it really kind of is bringing us to that place where we almost are allowed to experience the suffering that occurred. So he had this one installation where he put a lot of photographs of Jewish school children taken in Vienna. And he's commenting on the mass murder of the Jews by the Nazis, and he put them in these installations where he would use light to project, and then he would also combine that with these photographs in other rooms. Sometimes he would create these, he called them shadow boxes, where he would hang photographs and lights, and it would almost be sort of a memorial. And this is an installation where he used video. And this is another example of the shadow box. Sometimes he would take these little items that were found, like little crosses or other little items, and he would project and create these shadows on the walls. And then the light was such that when you went in, you really were captivated by all these amazing little shadows that were surrounding the room, all these little objects. This is another part of his installation, and you can see the magnitude of it. And he's kind of blurring the boundary between truth and fiction. I'm not sure all of the photos, were legitimate, but he's creating this sense of tragedy through all these photographs, and you're sort of imagining how many people disappeared during the Holocaust. Sophie Calle is another artist that uses a grid-based approach. She's a photographer and an installation artist. She's also a conceptual artist. And she did a couple of series. This particular one is where she called it The Blind, and she interviewed blind people and asked them to define beauty. And their responses were accompanied by photographic interpretations of their ideas. And so she would, for example, ask a sightless person to express their vision of beauty, and then she would take a photograph of them and then a photograph to sort of articulate what they were describing. And she would often put like a quote in. And so in this example, this girl is sort of talking about this voluptuous female form she ran her hands over in the Musée Rodin. And so Sophie Calle took a picture of the actual sculpture and of the girl, and then she had a quote in the installation. She also did this interesting series where she was hired as a chambermaid in a hotel in Venice, and she documented the different rooms and how people would lay their clothes out and organize their stuff. And it was very private and intimate, and it made you feel almost like you were seeing something you shouldn't see. It was very interesting. And then you can see the layout and how she's using this sort of grid-based approach in her layout, very formulaic. The photos are almost they're sort of chaotic. There's lots of information in these photos, but the way she laid it out organized the material so that it was very digestible. And here's another example of that. And sometimes she would put like a color photo in of the room before the people arrived, and then she would put these kind of black and white images of what happened to the room after the people arrived. And then she would kind of describe the experience in these paragraphs up here. Bernd and Hilla Becker were a collaborative, they were two fine artists that were collaborating, and they went around the world and they took these photographs of modern industrial buildings, old factory sites. And this was in around the late 1950s. And they really described their subjects as buildings where anonymity is accepted to be the style. But when they put them all together, it's kind of transformed, because you look at this series of buildings knowing that these were photographed all over the world, but look how similar they are and how connected they are. So it's interesting. This was another group from that series. And then Piet Mondrian is a fine artist, and he is known for being one of the pioneers of 20th century abstract art. And he sort of changed his artistic direction from figurative painting to an increasing sort of abstract style. until he reached a point where his artistic vocabulary was reduced to these simple geometric elements. And he's really searching for universal values and aesthetics. And so he would title his pieces, like, for example, this one is Composition 2 in red, blue, and yellow. And you can see the grid-based approach to the layout. And there's a good quote from him. He said, "Art is higher than reality and has no direct relation to reality. To approach the spiritual in art, one will make as little use as possible of reality because reality is opposed to the spiritual. We find ourselves in the presence of an abstract art." And so you can see that he was really trying as an artist to search meaning and spirituality through this very simplistic, abstracted body of work. Kind of look at one or two more. Andy Warhol, he was a very prolific artist and American artist. And he was born in 1928 and he died in 1987. And he was the central figure in the movement known as pop art. And a lot of his work were these prints that he would lay out in sort of a grid-based formula. And some of them he focused on, a lot of his work was about this idea of celebrity. And it's really interesting because he was doing this work pre-reality TV and pre-obsession with celebrity. If you look at today's culture, it's kind of amazing how tuned in he was to our desires to become celebrities in culture, because if you look at what happened to culture since like the 1950s, it's just totally transformed. And I think he was sort of a very prophetic in his approach and his style, because he kind of coined this term that everyone will have their 2 minutes of fame in the future. And so he did these beautiful sort of grid-based compositions. This one in particular is Jackie Onassis, and you can see he just would collage her face over and over again, different viewpoints. Sometimes she's sad, sometimes she's happy, and he's really sort of talking about this culture of celebrity that he was witnessing. This is Muhammad Ali. Sometimes he would add color in, or sometimes he would tint it. But he always, in these portrait series, would make it very grid-based, very organized. And this was a dialogue in the strip of a kind of like a cartoon where he's being interviewed, and you can see his answers in the white. This was one on Mickey Mouse. And this is just, I don't know who created this. It's just another example of a fine artist really utilizing the grid. And so thinking about what the grid can do for you, a grid can enable you to build structure and form into your designs. And that is really important, especially if you're dealing with a lot of information. So for example, text, if you have a lot of text you have to deal with, a grid can really organize and make that text legible. So one way that you might think about using a grid is you're going to, at its very basic level, you're going to divide your space into different columns. And then these columns are going to maybe intersect horizontally and vertically. And you're going to use these columns to lay the work out. And for multi-page design, this becomes really critical. Books, magazines, newspapers, websites, brochures, annual reports, because this can be a way that you maintain emphasis when you have to put together a lot of information. And so it creates emphasis, unity, and balance throughout the pages. So one thing you can start to do is, as you open up magazines and books and newspapers, or if you look at websites, for example, try to see how many columns you can see, how are the visual elements organized, and you'll see that the elements are almost always organized on a grid. So this is an example of a 2-column grid and a 4-column grid below. And you can see that in this layout, they're using a 4-column grid. So it's a grid system is a way of providing a system that designers can work with to structure and present content and imagery in a much more readable and manageable way. And using a grid system in your design is one way to achieve this level of consistency that would otherwise be extremely difficult to master and to portray in your designs. And it really allows you to design in proportions, balancing between all the different elements that you might have in your design. So you can see here, this is sort of the structure of the grid. And in Illustrator or Photoshop, you create these grids using your grid lines. And you would create measurements maybe between the columns, like put a 1/4 inch space or a 1/2 inch space at the top or at the bottom or at the left or the right. And then you would just kind of precisely measure out the size. 10 inches by 10 inches is what this example is. And, all rules are meant to be broken, but a grid system is something that you can use for layout. It's often something that is blurred, where content might start out in a grid, but then become a lot more free. Emigre is a great experimental type magazine to look at. Because there's a lot of design in here in Emigre where the grid was completely abandoned, or they might have started with a grid but then completely abandoned it. So I encourage you to look at these sort of innovative type magazines, and because it's kind of a good example of how when you sometimes break the rules, it becomes really compelling as well. So sometimes a grid is not apparent, sometimes it is, but the important thing as a designer is to always carefully plan out your layout, and what you're trying to do when you put the elements in the space is create a sense of unity, but also you want a sense of variety. And you can see, notice how the design transfers to the shirts, to the CD, to the cover. There is a grid, yet there's also this kind of organic shape that's sort of going through all 3 spaces. So Joseph Mueller Brockmann, this is who you're going to be creating a design for. You're designing a postcard that's going to announce his exhibition at MoMA. And he's really important because he was a pioneer of Swiss graphic design. There's another video lecture specifically on Swiss graphic design that I want you to look at. But Joseph Mueller Brockmann was a huge figure in this movement. He wrote multiple books on grid design, and his philosophy was that you cannot learn to become an artist, but you can learn to become a useful graphic artist. And so he invented this grid system to help designers with their layout. It was meant to be a problem-solving tool for them to help lay out text. So he was born in 1914 in Switzerland, a very huge figure in the Swiss movement. He studied architecture, design, and art history, but then he was going to become an illustrator at one point, but he decided that he didn't really have enough talent for it. And so he started to explore layout with type, and he decided that design was something that he could really master. So if you look at his layouts, you'll notice that there's always a structure in place where he's beginning and ending his content. Sometimes content will kind of go and spread throughout the whole design, and that's going from maybe 1 column to 2 columns to 3 columns, and the information might spread to all 3 columns. But with his type, he often was very specific about the placement and aligned it very carefully to one of the lines. So if you look at Swiss style, you'll notice that there's very ordered and refined text layout, but there's also this sort of captivating use of scale. Often photographs were used with Swiss style, grayscale photographs, and they would be really large. And there were definitely influences. Constructivism, Bauhaus influenced influenced Joseph Müller-Brockmann in his work. And his book was published in 1981, and it was called Grid Systems. But his approach is that he wanted there to be a system in place that was absolute and universal, and that you could express what the problem was through an objective and impersonal presentation. So the important thing with his work is he wanted it to be legible, he wanted it to be interesting, he wanted it to communicate and solve the problem given to him by the client. So he felt that the designer's feelings should not persuade the audience. There should be a formulaic approach to layout that made it easy for a designer to sort of remove themselves from the content and solve the problem at hand, which is laying out the content and making the content legible and apparent to the audience. So look at this. This is the grid in place, and you can see how the text is aligning with the lines here. And then there's some graphical elements, and then some of the text is sort of spreading between two columns, but it's all carefully aligned. And then you can see this example where the text is, it's taking the grid out of the space, and you can see it without the lines in place, and how much it allows you to digest the information, but it's still very appealing and contemporary. Great use of scale, taking the elements and making them kind of reach inside using this sense of space. Color is very strategic. So if there's color applied, it's well thought out and it's almost never chaotic. Usually there's just one color with gray, black, and white, or there might be two colors, a complementary color scheme, for example, or potentially three colors, but it would never be just sort of random. It would always have something directly related to the message. So you can see this clean aesthetic, limited use of color, feels very current today. Like you could see this design today and it would still feel very, very contemporary. This was a design, Musica Viva, and the colored squares are sort of marching in a musical rhythm. And they're supposed to kind of communicate this idea of the rhythm of music. So the grid's always an underlying player in Brockmann's designs. In some work, he even makes it visible. So you can see it here with this negative space. This was a poster. Let's see. This one actually. This Akari one was a poster advertising an exhibition of lamps. And so you can see how this modulated, glowing, multicolored discs signifies sort of the radiant energy of lighting fixtures. And so thinking about this color really carefully and how it relates to the content was important. I just love this sense of depth and scale in this photograph, but then how carefully the text is laid out. And the other thing you'll notice is that the visual hierarchy of the text is always important. So there's text elements that you need to read first, and then there's other text elements that you might read second, third, and so on. But that visual hierarchy plays an important role in the design and the use of scale and the use of placement. So I think that's my last image. So as you design your postcard this week, think of Joseph Mueller Brockman and sort of who he was and look at his work. You can Google him and see a lot of examples of his work. And that should play into your process and what imagery you decide to use. A lot of students just use an image of Carson and then they do a typographic layout. Some students bring in really simple graphics like circles or rectangles or squares and apply a simple color scheme and then do a precise layout with the text using a grid. And you probably want to create a 3-column grid for this project. And you can see in some of the sketch examples, there's a 3-column grid in place. And there's a rule called the rule of thirds, and that's a technique where designers sort of divide their designs up into 3 rows and 3 columns. And at the points where the vertical and horizontal lines meet, that's where the focal points should be. And there's a good video on that I included in this week's assignments that shows you the rule of thirds. So I encourage you to watch that so that you understand that process. So just let me know if you have any questions.